Thank you, Simona, for that very kind introduction. Thank you very much. It's sort of tea time here in Bahrain, and it's the kind of weather now where I can open my window and have fresh air coming into my window, because most of the time you can't do that. And so I was just enjoying a cup of tea, and it's the last day of term for us, so all of our faculty have already gone home, but they brought gifts in the form of many, many sumptuous cakes. So I was having a bit of cake with my tea here. So it's lovely to see you all. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really honored. And so my job today is to talk a little bit about the book that I've just written, called, and I have to get the title right, Sustainable Educational Leadership and the Climate Crisis, Knowledge, Power, and Positive Futures. So there you are. There's a little mini abstract already in the title. And what it is really about is, as you can imagine, it's taking the concepts of educational leadership and the climate crisis and bringing them together. So being a scholar of educational leadership, it's long been noticeable for me that this is a topic which doesn't get much airtime. The climate crisis is always seen as something that's external to what we do in educational management, administration, and leadership. Even in education policy, it's something that is a kind of peripheral thing that, sort of teenage Scandinavian girls do, or people who feel a bit right on go and do. And for me, the conversation is quite a different one, because I see this as being something quite central and deeply important to the future of the children that we're educating and their children, because the degradation of planet Earth and the degradation of species, the minimization of species, increasing overpopulation, increasing pollution, these are the impending crises of the future. And they're crises for which we, as a species, humanity, are quite obviously not prepared, and for which we have no solutions or answers. And this always brings me back to the question as to why don't we have solutions and answers? And the answer to that is in the question. It's because we always seek for solutions when sometimes there aren't any solutions like this. And what is important in educational leadership, management, administration is not that schools, colleges, and nurseries are responsible for the climate. How can they be? They're already responsible for so many things, aren't they? Teachers are responsible for the social and emotional welfare of students. They're responsible for policing the schools, for confiscating weapons, sometimes for making sure that the parents have better relationships between each other, making sure the children have better relationships with the parents. In many broken societies, schools are often leaned upon to be the unguent, the glue that fixes society and that pulls it back together again. Because in pure desperation, there seem to be very few spaces left in our societies which are not intrinsically focused upon ideas of entrepreneurialism, profits, marketing, and selling yourself to the highest bidder. And as society progresses from the 1980s to where we are now, we find that there are very few organizations that actually do this anymore. And perhaps schools are the last bastion of places where things like emotional labor and compassionate labor still exist, where people actually don't work the job because they're trying to buy their next Porsche or afford their next rental bill. They're actually working because they feel compelled to it, because they have a vocation for it, because deep inside them, they have an emancipatory drive to make things better and to change their world and the world around them. And therefore, the leadership, management, and administration of these extraordinary places with these extraordinary groups of people who stand out on planet Earth as people who are concerned with its future. So the leadership of that should be concerned with the future of our planet, because the future of our planet hinges upon what our students go out into the world and do when they become adults and when they become citizens. So we might not be responsible as educational leaders for the climate crisis, and we shouldn't be, but we must never underestimate the influence that we have in our schools, colleges, nurseries, and universities. If you think about it, from Lenin all the way through to Stalin, all the way through Hitler, and you name it, all the big dictators have already always fully understood how to use education to dominate society and dominate their citizens. And this is something we should be very afraid of. And unfortunately, we see in many aspects of our globalizing world increasing moves to make this happen, where ideologies colonize the schools and the colleges and nurseries that we're used to. Even if the colonization is hidden behind a decolonization, this happens as well. Where, for example, in my country, in Britain, I'll talk about England because we're a devolved system. The concept that a parent or a teacher should be no, the parent or the family should be responsible for the civics and the values that are imbued in a child is paramount. So the school no longer has a place to say, these are the collected and shared values that we have as a society. This is how we should go out into the world. We should protect our environment. We should look after the animals that are around us. We should nurture and respect our relationships between each other. We should foster kindness between each other rather than competitiveness and ambition and destruction. These things are no longer allowed to be said in schools in many places, because what that implies is that the state is controlling the individual. And this all smacks of communism, doesn't it? Or socialism or fascism, or you name it. So this is how the discourse has often sort of backed educators into a corner where they're no longer in a position to be able to even articulate the positive values of a positive society without sounding like they're colonizing and ideologically influencing their students. And then on the other extreme, you have countries like China, who very clearly and very, very strongly articulate precisely what they believe their people should think, how they should think it, when they should think it, and what that means. And so my work has been a lot in the field of international and comparative education, where we often slip in between the cracks of these two major movements or discourses, if you like. And so there is enormous potential for experimentation and for trying out new things and new ideas. And so that always got me thinking about, what would leadership in a large international school be able to do, for example, to actually galvanize action amongst these future leaders, because children from privileged backgrounds who have a more privileged education will end up in more privileged positions in society. They will have more say in how that society works. They will steer it in particular ways. So there's a good argument to be made there that these are possibly very important places to engage in forms of education that bring about emancipation, that bring about thinking of positive futures for the world. So those are all the thoughts that are going through my head as I'm thinking about writing this book. And the tricky thing is that you always come back to the idea that no matter how much we talk about the climate crisis, the way that we talk as educators to children and to each other is always based upon archaeologies of knowledge, or let's move it further and say genealogies of knowledge, which are rooted in a history that is in itself deeply, deeply flawed. And we keep on excavating them and bringing them to the fore again, resting upon them and saying, and this is how we will solve the future problems of the world. But this is like, I don't know, this is like taking the poison that made you sick and taking it again every day in smaller doses and hoping that it will make you well again. And it won't. It doesn't matter how well you package it or how well you sell it or how glitzy it looks. It's still going to ontologically have the same effect. So my book becomes then about knowledge and knowledge generation. and about how we as educators can begin to foster a climate that pushes beyond the boundaries of these staid archaeologies of knowledge. Just very briefly, these are rooted mostly, and I'm drawing upon the work here of many comparative educators, Brehm and Cohen, but also Troller and Macic, who, particularly Troller, who considers that many of our knowledges and ways of thinking, our epistemologies, are essentially they're Protestantist Calvinist notions that come out of extraordinary 30 years war, which really reshaped Europe. I mean, think about it. Go back to the 1500s in Europe. This is a war that lasted for 30 years. It came after the Reformation, brother and sister fighting against each other for 30 years at a time when people didn't live longer than 30. So it was a lifetime war. It was an intergenerational war. It was notable for the most excessive bouts of cruelty, torture, death. There were two plagues in that time that wiped out millions of people. The plagues were carried around by the armies that went from city to city. There were two significant droughts at the time, which killed millions. In some parts of Europe, there were up to 70% of the population killed. Generally, we think it's about 40% of Europe died. It was apocalyptic beyond compare. And out of this war comes the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment thing. Navid, could you mute your microphone, please? Thank you. And out of this war comes the Enlightenment. And Enlightenment thinkers sit down quite rationally and say, right, we need to change the world. We can never, ever again war based upon belief, Protestantism against Catholicism as it was at the time. Therefore, reason will be what dictates us in what we do. We believe in reason. And Troller's point's very accurate here. He says all of these people, most of them, were Protestants, and they had a deep, deep belief in reason. But their belief was a belief as you would have a belief in a God. And a belief is not a knowing. So the belief in reason becomes an acceptance of reason beyond its actual factual capacity to provide something justifiable and true. It becomes a belief. And this sets off the age of reason, which is underpinned by positivism. And here we find ourselves, this will be old news to many of you listening, here we find ourselves 300 or 400 years later, still in thrall to this way of thinking, which is about generalizable rules, about things that simply are. And if there's a problem, there's a solution. And this is how we build not only our societies, but how we build our education systems. It's how we build our schools. It's how we build our administrational systems. It's how we hold meetings in school. It's how we run disciplinary procedures. It's in everything that we do. So my book challenges this way of thinking about the world. And it seeks its roots. It seeks its genealogies. It explores them. It goes into them. It exposes them. And it then brings us as a species out of this whole thing and says, so why is it that we're like this? Why is it that we do this? Why is it that Homo sapiens sapiens, remember our genus has got twice sapiens after the name, because sapiens is wise. We are twice wise in our naming. The reason why we are wise is because what makes us distinct is the fact that we are knowers. And as Habermas would point out from his emancipatory thinking domain, this also makes us special as creatures, because we are concerned with knowing and improving who we are and what we are through knowing, unlike any other creature. So what are the things that make us special? Well, many people say it's our hands. We've got 5 fingers. We're tool makers. We can make tools. This is what makes us apex animal. But it isn't really, is it? Because monkeys have 5 hands as well, and they're not apex animal. And some say it's our brain. We have this large brain. Well, actually, our brain is proportion to body size the same as a rodent's. A blue whale has a much larger brain than we do. An ant, in proportion to its body, has a huge brain, much larger than ours, and yet still we are the standout animal on planet Earth that is in the position that we're in now. So what is it? And then it comes down to quite a simple fact, actually. It's this thing here on my throat. It's the voice box. And the voice box allows Homo sapiens sapiens to communicate very complex thought. That means it allows Homo sapiens sapiens to strategize for the future. That's all well and good, but what makes the big moves of humanity possible is the software that we run in our brains, which allows us to be sociable and communicative. So what really makes us different is that we are able to work and collaborate and cooperate in groups, strategize for the future. And this is humanity's superpower. This is what made us apex animal. And now if you roll back that thinking about how we got here, where we are, what our ways of thinking are all about, our ways of thinking increasingly in the 21st century are deeply hierarchical. They're based upon some external other who knows better and who tells us what to do. It's like in the Teletubbies, that little voice in the background that's always telling us and narrating to us what we have to do. And our school systems in many ways reinforce this idea amongst children that there is an authority, it knows best, and if you're unsure, go and ask the authority or wait until you're told what to do. And everything that we do sets us up for that reality. But the problem is, none of these things are what make us exceptional as a species. In fact, quite the contrary. So it's almost like we're witnessing a reverse evolution of our species, that all the things that made us special are now the things that no longer have any import anymore in our species. And so why is that? And what is the issue with us? So then I introduced this German thinker, actually Austro-German thinker from around about the 1930s called Günther Anders. Very interesting character. He studied under Martin Heidegger and under Husserl, Edmund Husserl as well, who are Husserl was the father of phenomenology, and Martin Heidegger, his student, who then probably took it even further. Heidegger, deeply problematic figure with his political associations, but nevertheless, so Martin Heidegger became a National Socialist, and he was one of that first wave of German academics who usurped Jewish academics and took their chairs and took their places in the 1930s. Thomas Mann writes an excellent book about this called Der Dr. Faustus, which is quite an impenetrable book, but a definite good read if you can stomach it. But there, Günther Anders is a student of Heidegger, so he becomes trained as a phenomenologist. Interestingly, Hannah Arendt, the notable political philosopher, is also a student of Martin Heidegger's, in fact, his doctoral student. And curiously, she and Martin Heidegger become a couple, and they end up having a steamy affair. Although he was her PhD supervisor, colleagues. I mean, come on, this is awful practice. I'm not condoning this at all, but there you are. There's Arendt and Heidegger having this steamy affair in the 1930s. Heidegger was married, by the way. And then along come the Nazis. And the difficulty there was that both Günther Anders and Hannah Arendt were both Jewish. So this was a bit of a problem, I'm sure you can imagine. I mean, we think of our academic problems today. We have no idea compared to what those problems must have been like. So Günther Anders flees from Germany with Hannah Arendt, and they get married, which is very interesting. And they live together for about 5 or 6 years in Paris, and then they move to New York, and they go their separate ways. Günther Anders is touched by these experiences, and he calls himself ein Volksphilosoph, so a people's philosopher, not so much an academic philosopher like Heidegger was. But his thinking is remarkable because what he does is he writes a great deal about technology and the influences of technology. And if you know Martin Heidegger's work, there's one important piece he wrote called Die Technologie und die Kehre, which is about technology and its effects upon humanity. Gunther Anders pulls this thought away from Heidegger, um, disembeds it from him, and goes with it in terms of the technology of the post-war period. And he's focused very much upon the atomic bomb and the destructive power of it, which at that time was extraordinary for humanity, for conceiving of who we are. And his thesis becomes one which is about a couple of concepts. One of them is called Promethean shame. This is the notion that we as human beings have created technologies which are so awesome that we are put to shame by them. We now no longer manifest as the apex of creation on planet Earth. Our technologies do. And so we're no longer in the position to take agency over our world because the technologies have taken agency for us. This is a very interesting concept to deal with, given everything I've been saying about how our species has evolved and how our societies work. And then another one is his concept of the antiquatedness of humanity. He posits that humanity has, through its development of awesome technologies, put itself in a place where evolutionary, the human, has not been able to keep up with the implications of its technology. So I've explored this in quite a lot of detail in the book as to what this means to us as we teach and learn in schools and what implications it has on teaching and learning and leading education. And I can't sum up the whole book in a few sentences, but in brief, I'll try my best. It's essentially that when we come to think about how we engage in the world with technology, what technology does for us is that it moves us out of the primary space, out of the limelight. It moves us into a space where we become lesser than the actual technology. But because we are human beings, and because our brain last evolved 40 to 50,000 years ago when we started using complex tools, our brain hasn't evolved yet to comprehend the consequences of the technologies. So we're very good as tool makers to pick anything up and run with it and go, oh, wow, look, this is interesting. Oh, I can use this. Oh, that's great. And because of the scope of our lifetimes, as humans, we're very good at being able to strategize. Unlike animals, we can strategize in terms of years, decades, even lifetimes. But we can't strategize beyond that. What we can do is we can think it through, we can imagine it, we can write it down, but we can't effectively accommodate the consequence of 100 years or of 50 years or of 2 centuries, because it simply goes beyond our evolutionary capability mentally to be able to do so. So this is why it's quite perplexing for all of us. We're sat here looking at the pretty imminent destruction of the ecosphere that supports human life. We know this is happening and will happen over the next 500 to 1,000 years as a result of the changes we have made to the planet in the Anthropocene. And yet we're all quite calm about it. We'll go home and switch on the TV. We'll all get up and have breakfast and make ourselves a nice cup of tea, and we'll go to work. And then at different parts during the week, like now, we'll all sort of reflect and go, my goodness, isn't it awful? Isn't this dreadful? And we have the empathetic capacity, even in groups, to comprehend how awful that is, but we don't have the capacity to be able to see the end point and the consequence of what the technology does. And that, I think, is the essence of Anders's point. And it's not an easy point, it's quite a complex one, but it's like the crisis we see. It's a complex one. It's not an easy one. And this is where we see humanity reaching its boundary. We're starting to reach the boundary of our evolution because the pace of technological evolution has increased at a pace that has far outstripped our ability to evolve with it. And because we're good at getting by and dealing with stuff, we are literally outwitting ourselves. We can't see it. And Anders says very, very charmingly, he says, it's because we're antiquated. We are antiquated in the face of the technologies that are in front of us. So that's where I get to in the book, into this to this sort of quite poignant understanding that the way that we in schools, colleges, nurseries, and universities tend to teach and organize our systems. Remember, it's not just about what we teach, because we can often teach critical things and we can teach good knowledges, but it's the way that we manifest as teachers, the way that we do things. As you know, Bandura famously says, children don't do what you say, they do what you do. And so we lead these funny parallel lives where we go to school and we tell children what's right and we tell them what to do. And then the moment we leave the front door, we go back into the other reality, which is the one where we're burning all the fossil fuels, we're throwing away all the plastic, we're eating all the animals that are pushing other animals out of their habitats, killing off biodiversity. So we're doing all the things that are killing the planet. The children see us doing all the things that are killing the planet. So of course they go and do what we do as well. And we all develop this very, very charming and antiquated way of talking quite critically about how everything is going off wrong, getting quite good at doing it without actually doing anything about it at all. So there are several, thinking of this more positively, there are several things that have gone wrong over the last 30 to 40 years, particularly, we must see this as a confluence of tragic events. One of them is the hyperalization of capitalisms, where being a citizen is no longer about a political act, it's a consumerist act. We are now consumer citizens. Michael Apple is very good on this. I recommend him. We are consumer citizens who are valid in our societies because of the choices that we make in the supermarket or in Amazon. So we are no longer defined by who we might vote for. And that indeed is no longer very important, who we vote for. What's important is how we represent ourselves through the clothes that we wear, the cars that we drive, the phones that we have, the groups that we belong to. To recommend that you read, again, I must thank Nick Palmer for buying me this book in Azerbaijan about 15 years ago. Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle. It's an extraordinary book. And if you read that together with Baudrillard's Simulacrum, this will give you an idea of where I'm going with my thinking in the book, as combine that with Anders. You've got these technologies that are altering our reality. And we as, I'm 53. So for me, I grew up in a world without internet. I grew up in a world without mobile phones. They started to happen when I was in my early 20s. And when I look at my own children, they live in a completely different reality. They've grown up in this world. They know nothing different from it. And yet this world is a world of spectacle, as Guy Debord would say. It's not about what you are. It's not about what you have, even. It's about what you can demonstrate and represent for a moment. That moment is captured and held eternally as evidence of who you are. This, combined with the consumer citizen, combined with the methodologies and systems that we use as teachers to teach and to manage, all combine into a perfect storm that sort of, reproduces the inequalities that we so hate. And so things that we're losing sight of the arts. We used to teach the arts, at least in Britain and in Europe. We used to teach them a lot more than we do now, and they are dying out. And the arts are the things that connect us with our soul, with our affinity for each other, with our, any old pedagogue in here will know it's about the affective side of what we are in teaching, not just the cognitive, the rationalization that we can then put in a drawer and then leave till tomorrow when we pull it out again. No, the affective, the things that get us invested in our climate, invested in our world. And we're losing the arts. And so it's time now, in my view, to reignite the arts, to bring them back into the mainstream, to make them a part of how we lead, how we manage. The hippies in the 1960s were a long time ago. We are now in a different age, an age of crisis. And perhaps, the arts is not something that you need necessarily, like my mother would associate hippies with people with long hair walking around smoking joints. No, the arts have a really strong and important part in humanity's continued evolution. They always have played an extraordinarily important role. And now, if you look at the statistics in Britain about how many children take art subjects, it's depressing. It's frightening. For example, my three children recently all did A-level German. Well done, good on them. And when I did A-level German in the 1980s, there were 32 children in my class. None of my children have been in a class where they haven't either been the only student or one of two. That's just languages to give you an idea as to what's happening in Britain, for example, with the arts. There is a war against the arts. The arts are no longer valued because they're not something that's considered to be job capital or cash capital, whereas this is all dominated knowledge. We all know that the arts are subjects that get people jobs. And yet that brings me to the next, or the concluding final point of the book, is knowledge generation. The knowledges that we consume that inform our practices in educational leadership particularly are all dominated knowledges. That is to say, they are broadly drawn from the larger generic business-ified philosophy of business, and they are dominated in Habermasian terms because they're knowledges that are not based upon validity, they're based upon influence, they're based upon sales, they're based upon somebody trying to influence you. That is a dominated knowledge. So most of the knowledges that you'll find around you in educational leadership particularly tend to, or the very popular ones at least, tend to come from dominated sources. So they draw upon methodologies of research that you'll find you can drive a bus through usually. There are so many gaps in them. They tend not to make much sense. They're very often quite artful in the way that they're put together by quite authoritative figures in their fields, written very beautifully and very nicely, and they tend to reinstate the doxic notions of what reality is in educational leadership and management, about effectiveness and efficiency. But the data itself is not unpacked in a way that delivers any form of truth, because they're rooted on archaeologies of knowledge that are deeply dominated, and this is part of the system that we all live in and we all abide by. So and in my final chapter, I talk a great deal about Marxism and about Marx and about post-Marxist thinkers, because many of us, if we want to push away from that narrative, this is where we'll seek our form of truth. And yet, even when you delve deeper into Marx, you'll find that even his thinking is deeply rooted in the functionalities of the Enlightenment, which again restricts many of our more progressive thinkers in the way that they look at the world. Finally, this book is about seeking out a new paradigm for thinking. And it's not going to be introduced, a new paradigm for thinking, by politicians, certainly not. It's not going to be introduced by care workers in nursing homes or people in hospitals. It might be introduced by artists, but who listens to them? The way that it might gain some form of traction is in the way that we lead and manage our schools, in how we treat each other as educational professionals, how we work with each other, how we nurture and sustain collaboration with each other, how we draw upon those apex tools of humanity, and how we lead by example in schools, how we involve the artistic nature of mankind into what we do, into our practices, how we generate and celebrate creativity and innovation and beauty and aesthetic, all the things that we are losing from this planet, all the things that we are destroying because of our consumer push, because of our society of the spectacle. Perhaps it's time for us to reorient how we do leadership in schools, colleges, and nurseries by taking a different view and engaging a different paradigm. Like I said, I think the arts are probably going to be central in this. And I also think that it's a humbling moment for humanity where we have to take a step back and think of, with a lot of chagrin, who we are and our own limitations, and that we're possibly not quite as amazingly brilliant as we think we are, and that our own limitations have brought us to a precipice. The second part of this book is probably going to be about AI, because there is an enormous potential there, perhaps to hand a baton over to something which might be able to help us. But there's also an enormous, incredible danger as well in, if AI begins to act and be like we've been for the last 40 years, then we're doomed. But if it can do what we've done for the last 100,000 years, then we might be all right. And I'll stop on that note.
Thank you very much, Alex. I will stop the recording and I will open the floor for discussion, because I think there are many questions and ideas there. So yeah, I'm stopping the recording, and then whoever wants to say something, just put your hand up and then we'll take it from there. Thank you.